The sinister rustle of rain outside the window disrupted the silence of the house, which had always seemed too spacious for its emptiness to Cameron. He stood by the window, watching as the drops trickled down the glass, as if trying to escape the dark sky. For the first time in a long while, there was something different, elusive in this house. This different had arrived today morning, along with a girl he had never seen before. Annabelle. Her name had rolled off his father's tongue as if it were a fact Cameron had to accept without question. Bella hadn't even graced him with a fleeting glance when she entered the house. She paused at the doorway, with a bag slung over her shoulder, her black hair falling over her face, concealing the expression in her eyes. Behind her followed Cameron's mother, who was now not just his mother, but this stranger's stepmother. "Cameron, this is Annabelle. She will be staying with us for a while," his father said dryly, his gaze flicking from Bella to his son and back, as if checking to see if something might explode. Annabelle merely nodded, brushing past Cameron with icy calm, as if he were a piece of furniture. Her steps, quick and decisive, echoed down the hallway towards the stairs. She disappeared upstairs, leaving behind the scent of rain and something sharp, as if she herself were a storm. Cameron sat in the kitchen, listening to the unfamiliar sounds upstairs. His house had always been too quiet, and now this strange contrast was unsettling. The sound of Bella's footsteps, doors opening and closing, her barely audible voice talking on the phone, it all added to the unease. Suddenly there was a noise. At first Cameron thought it was the television, but no, it was a deep, resonant chord from the piano, which cut through the walls and echoed throughout the house. His heart tightened. They rarely used this old instrument. It stood in the living room, covered in dust, like a forgotten relic. But Bella was playing, and she played as if the piano were an extension of her soul. Cameron stood up, as if someone had pushed him. He walked down the hallway toward the living room, trying not to make a sound. The music grew louder but not happier. Each note seemed heavy, painful. When he reached the doorway, Bella stopped, her fingers frozen over the keys. She turned to him. Her gaze was so sharp that Cameron wanted to step back. "Eavesdropping?" she said with a slight smirk, but there was no joy in her voice. Cameron felt the blood rush to his face. "No, just, you play very strongly," he mumbled. Bella slowly stood up, crossed her arms, and looked at him with slight irritation. "Strongly? That's not even a compliment, Cameron, but I'll take it since you can't say anything else." Her words were cold, but there was something more behind them. Cameron noticed how her eyes shimmered, as if she were trying to hold back emotions. But instead of continuing the conversation, she turned and walked out, leaving him alone in the room. Cameron looked at the piano. The keys still vibrated from her playing. He ran his finger over the smooth surface of the instrument and felt that this touch somehow connected him to her. She was a closed book, but Cameron knew one thing. He had to find out what was hidden on her pages. The silence of the living room was suddenly broken. It wasn't music, but Bella's voice. She was talking on the phone, her tone softer than Cameron had expected. He stood in the kitchen doorway, involuntarily eavesdropping. "No, I'm fine. Just a little tired." Her voice faltered, and Cameron caught a note of weariness that she was trying to hide. "Don't worry, Mom, everything will be okay." A second later, the phone was back in place. Bella sat on the couch, her gaze fixed on the window. Cameron took a deep breath and walked into the room. "You play well," he said, trying not to show his excitement. Bella slowly turned, her eyes flashing with surprise. It seemed she didn't expect anyone to talk to her, especially him. "Thank you," she replied briefly, but her voice was not as cold as before. "Was that some famous melody?" Cameron sat down in the chair opposite her, crossing his arms to hide the trembling in his fingers. "No," Bella sighed. "It's just something I composed. A kind of reflection." "Reflection?" he echoed. "On what?" She hesitated, as if deciding whether to answer. "On life, the past, the present, all of it. Music is the only thing that helps me cope." Cameron nodded, feeling that there was more behind her words. He didn't know how to ask about it directly, but didn't want to miss the chance. "Have you been playing for a long time?" he finally asked. Bella smiled slightly, but there was more sadness than joy in her smile. Since I can remember, my mom insisted that I start learning. Back then I hated it, and now it's my way of surviving. Surviving? Cameron frowned. You say it as if you had no choice. Many of us don't, Cameron, Bella replied sharply, her gaze turning as cold as ice. We just live the best we can. There was a moment of silence. Cameron felt the atmosphere in the room becoming tense. He wanted to continue the conversation, but didn't know how to choose the right words. I'm sorry, Bella said unexpectedly. I can be too blunt sometimes. It's not about you. Cameron relaxed a bit, hearing her apology. It's okay. You just seem a bit lonely, that's all, he replied, not even understanding how he dared to say such words. Bella looked at him in surprise. There was something like gratitude in her eyes, but she quickly looked away. And you? You don't seem like someone who is comfortable in their own skin either. Cameron was taken aback. Her question caught him off guard, but looking into her eyes, he felt that she genuinely wanted to know. I don't know, he replied, trying to be honest. Maybe you're right. Sometimes I feel like I'm just drifting, not knowing where the current will take me. Bella nodded, her expression softening. Maybe that's our common trait, she said quietly. Cameron felt something change between them. This short conversation, so strange and unexpected, seemed to shift an invisible barrier. He didn't understand what exactly, but he knew one thing. He wanted to get to know Bella better. Do you have any plans for the evening? He suddenly asked, not fully realizing why. Bella looked at him with a slight smile, but there was still sadness in her eyes. I think I'll go to my room and try to compose something. And you? I could, listen, if you don't mind, he offered, feeling his heart pounding in his throat. Bella thought for a moment, but then nodded. Okay, but only if you promise not to give cheap compliments. Cameron laughed, even though there was no joke in her words. I promise. They both knew that their conversations were more than just words. It was the beginning of something that could change their lives. The rain tapped against the window, as if trying to break in, and the hollow echo of the drops was the only sound breaking the silence. Cameron sat in the kitchen, staring at an empty coffee cup. Thoughts of Bella hadn't left him since the moment he heard her play. Her music, her voice, even her sharp but gentle gaze, it all pulled him into a whirlwind from which he didn't know how to escape. The silence was broken by footsteps, light, almost inaudible, but Cameron immediately knew who it was. Bella entered the kitchen, her hair slightly disheveled, and her loose t-shirt seemed to emphasize her indifference to everything around her. She stopped by the sink, pouring herself a glass of water, not even glancing at Cameron. Good morning, he said, trying to sound casual. Bella turned, slightly raising an eyebrow, as if surprised that someone had decided to greet her. It's not morning anymore, she replied with a slight smirk, gulping down the water. Do you always sit here so early? Cameron shrugged. Sometimes. Do you always get up so early? Not always. She put the glass on the table and, to his surprise, sat down opposite him. Her eyes lingered on him a bit longer than he expected. Today, I just couldn't lie down anymore. The dreams were too loud. Loud? Cameron echoed, frowning. Have you never heard sounds in your dreams? She asked, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. Sometimes they scream, sometimes they whisper, but they always leave you feeling shattered when you wake up. Cameron fell silent, not knowing how to respond. For the first time, he saw in Bella not just coldness, but something vulnerable, almost fragile. I never thought you could be so sensitive, he finally said. Bella laughed, but her laughter was short and insincere. Everyone is sensitive, Cameron. Some people are just better at hiding it. She stood up, ready to leave, but paused. Did you want to ask something? She said without looking at him. Cameron froze. He wanted to ask so much, but was afraid that his questions would only push her away. Why do you play like that? He finally blurted out. There's so much pain in your music. Where does it come from? Bella turned to him, her gaze sharp as a blade. She looked at him for a long time, as if deciding whether to speak. Music is my way of surviving, she said quietly, almost repeating the words he had already heard. Is that what you wanted to hear? I want to understand, Cameron admitted. You came here and turned everything upside down. I just want to know who you really are. Who am I? Her voice grew colder. I am just fragments, Cameron. Pieces of the past that no one could put together. Cameron felt his throat tighten. He hadn't expected such an answer, but he knew there was more behind her words. Then give me a chance, he said softly. Maybe I can help you put those pieces together. Bella smirked, but there was no joy in her smile. You're too naive. You have no idea how much is in those fragments. She turned and left, leaving Cameron alone in the silence. He sat there, feeling her words echoing in his head. Later that evening, Cameron sat in his room when he heard a muffled thud. It was music. Bella was playing again, but this time the melody was different. It was dark, like a storm, heavy like a tempest. He couldn't resist. He quietly got up and made his way to her door. Her door was slightly ajar. The soft light from the lamp spilled onto the floor, and Bella sat by the window, a guitar on her lap. Her fingers touched the strings, as if they were the last sounds she could make. Do you always sneak up like that? Her voice pulled him out of his thoughts. She didn't even turn around. I'm sorry, he mumbled. It's just your music. She looked up, and to his surprise, she smiled. It was the most genuine smile he had seen from her. You're strange, Cameron, she said, but you know that's not so bad. And you're a mystery, he replied, his voice holding more warmth than he intended to show. They looked at each other, and for the first time, Cameron felt something real between them. Bella picked up the guitar again and continued to play. This time her music was softer, as if she allowed herself to forget the past, if only for a moment. Cameron didn't want to interrupt the moment. He simply sat on the floor by the door and listened. Evening descended on the city like a heavy blanket, swallowing the noise and colors of the day. The house was quiet. Cameron's parents had gone out for dinner, leaving him and Bella alone. He had always thought such moments should bring relief, but today everything was different. Bella's presence in the house filled the space with tension, almost palpable, like an electric charge in the air before a storm. Cameron sat on the couch in the living room, mindlessly flipping through TV channels. He couldn't concentrate. His thoughts kept returning to Bella. Since their conversation in the kitchen, she seemed to have withdrawn, avoiding him. But her music still rang in his head like a whisper, demanding answers. The sound of footsteps made him jump. Bella was coming down the stairs. She wore loose jeans and a black sweater with the faded logo of a rock band. Her hair was tousled as if she had just woken up. But her eyes? There was something in them that Cameron couldn't describe. A mix of weariness, loneliness, and something deeper. Do you always watch TV with such a bored expression? She asked, pausing at the doorway. Do you always make such sarcastic remarks? He retorted, not even looking away from the screen. She smirked and came closer. Sometimes, but only when I'm bored. And right now I'm bored. You could find something to do, he suggested, still trying to appear indifferent. Maybe play something? Bella narrowed her eyes as if studying him. I don't play on demand, she replied and sat down in the chair opposite him. And you? What do you even live for, Cameron? Do you like this life? This house? The question caught him off guard. I don't know, he admitted after a pause. I used to think it was okay, but now I'm not so sure. You think too much, she noted, crossing her legs on the chair. Sometimes you just have to accept things as they are. And you? Have you accepted? He asked, his voice holding a challenge. Bella looked away, her expression hardening. I realized a long time ago that there's no point in fighting. You just waste your energy. Cameron felt something tighten inside him. Her words were like a shield she hid behind, but he could see the pain behind that shield. That's not true, he said softly. Fighting is what makes us alive. Bella looked at him, her eyes shining, but she quickly looked away. Maybe, but sometimes life doesn't give you a choice. Silence hung in the air, tense and thick. Cameron wanted to say something, but he was afraid that any word might shatter the fragile moment. You know, Bella finally said, her voice softer, when I was little, I used to dream that one day everything would be different, that I would become someone who could just be happy. But now I know that it's just a dream. Cameron looked at her, his heart aching. Why do you say that? You don't know what will happen next. And you do? Do you really believe that everything can change? She asked, her voice almost desperate. Yes, he said firmly. Everything can change if we want it to. She smirked, but her smile was bitter. You're too good for this world, Cameron. It makes you vulnerable. And what's wrong with that? He asked, his voice soft but firm. Maybe I want to be vulnerable if it means I can feel. Their gazes met, and in that moment, something shifted. Bella was no longer hiding behind her mask. She was open, fragile, like glass. Cameron felt an invisible connection between them, so strong that he felt he could reach out and touch her. But Bella stood up and headed for the exit. I'm going outside. It's too stuffy in here, she threw over her shoulder. Cameron didn't hesitate. He stood up and followed her. They stood in the backyard under the dim light of the street lamp. The air was cool and fresh after the rain. Bella looked up at the sky, her arms crossed as if protecting herself from something unseen. Why did you follow me? She asked without turning around. Because I don't want to leave you alone, he answered honestly. Bella turned to him, her eyes meeting his. And you think you know what you're getting into? She said, her voice soft but with a warning. Maybe I don't, he replied, but I want to understand. She took a step closer and Cameron felt her presence. Her gaze was heavy, but there was something in it that made him hold his breath. You shouldn't, she began, but her voice trailed off. But I want to, he interrupted. For a moment silence hung between them. Then Bella turned away, her shoulders slumping. You're too close, Cameron, she said softly. I could break you. Then break me, he whispered. Her gaze flickered, but she didn't respond. Instead, she turned and walked away, leaving him alone under the cold light of the street lamp. The silence of the house was deceptive. Within the walls lurked a storm, ready to burst at any moment. Cameron sat in his room staring at a book he couldn't bring himself to start reading. Thoughts of Bella haunted him like a melody stuck in his head. She was in every corner of his mind, in every pause between the ticking of the clock. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. He looked up and saw Bella. She stood in the doorway like a ghost, her silhouette outlined by the soft light from the hallway. Can I come in? She asked, her voice softer than usual. Of course, he replied, feeling his heart race. Bella entered and closed the door behind her. She looked tense, her arms crossed as if she were holding herself together. Cameron felt that she was about to say something important, but he didn't know how to start the conversation. I want to talk, she finally said, sitting on the edge of his bed. About us. Those words hung in the air, filling the room with tension. Cameron sat across from her, his eyes trying to meet hers. About what exactly? He asked cautiously. Bella sighed and brushed a strand of hair from her face. All of this, from the beginning, I knew it was wrong. The way we look at each other, the way we talk, it shouldn't have happened. Why? Cameron interrupted, feeling his voice tremble. Why is it so wrong? We're just two people, Bella. That's all that matters. It's not all, she said sharply, her gaze turning cold. There are our families, Cameron. My mother, your father. Do you think they would understand? Cameron fell silent, understanding that she had a reason for her words. But something inside him rebelled against this logic. Maybe they wouldn't, he said softly. But this is our life, not theirs. Bella looked at him, and for a moment there was a glimmer of hope in her eyes, but it quickly faded. It sounds so simple, she whispered, but it's much more complicated. Cameron reached out and gently touched her hand. You always say that music is your way of surviving, he said. But isn't it worth living for something more than just survival? Bella froze, her eyes fixed on their intertwined fingers. For the first time, she didn't pull away. You don't know anything about me, Cameron, she said softly, about what I've been through. Then tell me, he replied, his voice gentle but firm. I want to know. Bella looked up, and in her gaze he saw struggle, but she began to speak. My mom, she always chose herself. When she had to choose between me and her desires, she chose herself. And then your dad came along. He was her salvation. But I was always something extra, something she had to take along. I I was never part of something real, and now I'm afraid it will happen again. But you're not extra, Cameron said firmly. Not to me. His words hung in the air, and then Bella did something he didn't expect. She leaned in, and their lips met. The kiss was tentative at first, almost shy, but then it deepened, as if they both wanted to drown in the moment. Cameron felt her hands slide over his shoulders, her breath becoming ragged. His heart pounded so loudly that he thought she could hear it, but instead of pulling away, Bella drew him closer. "This is wrong," she whispered, pulling back from him, but her voice was filled with passion. "Then let it be wrong," he replied, his arms wrapping around her. "But it's true." They didn't speak anymore. Words were no longer needed. Everything that needed to be said was reflected in their gazes and touches. That night became something more than just closeness for them. It was a turning point, a moment when they both accepted their decision, despite the consequences. The house stood in ominous silence. It seemed as if the walls were soaked with the secrets they held. Cameron sat on the edge of his bed, looking out the window where the morning light faintly illuminated the rain-soaked yard. It felt like an eternity had passed since that night when everything between him and Bella had changed. A knock at the door made him jump. Cameron looked up, expecting to see Bella, but it wasn't her silhouette. It was his father. He looked tired and his face reflected a vague unease. "We need to talk," he said briefly, entering the room. Cameron nodded, feeling a heavy weight settle in his chest. "What happened?" he asked, trying to hide his agitation. His father closed the door and leaned against the wall, as if gathering strength. "Bella, she's gone," he said, avoiding his son's gaze. Those words pierced Cameron like a knife. He felt his heart constrict, and his hands began to tremble. "What? Why?" he managed to say. His father handed him a piece of paper. "She says she needs to figure herself out, that she's not ready for this life here." Cameron grabbed the note. Bella's handwriting was neat, but the lines looked hurried. Her words held no personal touch, as if she deliberately tried to keep everything neutral. But between the lines, Cameron could feel her pain. "Cameron, I can't stay. I don't want to ruin what you have. Please understand. I'm not saying goodbye because that word is too heavy. Maybe our paths will cross again someday. Take care. Bella." He reread the note again and again, but found no comfort in it. She hadn't explained anything. She just left, leaving him with this emptiness. Later that day, Cameron went to the piano. It stood in the living room, covered in a thin layer of dust. He felt as if Bella could be there, playing that very melody that touched his heart. But instead of her, there was only silence. He sat down at the keys and carefully pressed one. The sound was muffled, like an echo of the past. He tried to reproduce something from her playing, but the melody slipped away like sand through his fingers. "Did you love her? Didn't you?" His father's voice pulled him from his thoughts. Cameron turned around. His father stood in the doorway, watching him with an expression Cameron couldn't read. I, he began but fell silent. He didn't know how to explain what he felt. "It was obvious," his father continued, sitting down on a chair next to the piano. "But sometimes love, it's more complicated than it seems. It requires sacrifices." "And why do I always have to be the one to sacrifice?" Cameron asked bitterly. His voice trembled. "Why couldn't she stay? Why couldn't we be together?" His father was silent for a long time, then slowly nodded. "Because sometimes the best way to love someone is to let them go. You need to understand that, son." Cameron looked away, feeling tears well up in his eyes. But he didn't want to cry. Not now. That evening, Cameron sat in the backyard where he and Bella had spent so much time. The gentle breeze rustled the leaves, and the moon cast a soft silver light over everything. Memories of her words, her smile, her gaze flooded his mind. All she had left him were memories. Cameron took out his phone and opened her contact. His fingers hovered over the call button. He wanted to hear her voice, ask where she was, beg her to come back. But instead, he typed a short message. "I hope you find what you're looking for. And if you ever decide to come back, I'll be waiting." He looked at the screen for a long time before hitting send. Then he put the phone back in his pocket and looked up at the stars. Maybe one day she would find her way back. Or maybe she was gone forever. But one thing he knew for sure, Bella had changed him. She had taught him to feel, to fight, to believe. And even if she was no longer by his side, her trace would stay with him forever. Cameron closed his eyes, allowing the night to embrace him, and for the first time in a long while, he felt that he could cope.